as Peter described, I'm going to talk to you about the research that I've carried out here, both at Kew and for London, and I'll show you and discuss some of the science that sits behind it when we start thinking about tree selection for the future. So, what a lot of the work we have to do is to understand what the potentials are for the future. So, when we think of that, we have to think of 2022. So if we can cast our minds back to 2022, when we look at our climate models, those summers of 2022 are going to become more normal. So by the end of the century, those summers of 2022 are going to become quite common. And if you look at this image, this is from the European Space Station, space satellite, and this is really an image of that drought period. And as you can see here, the worst affected is the east of the country. And this is where we really see that drying out process. And this is where the intensive heat was. So here at Kew, we had temperatures to 39.8 degrees recorded in 2022, and we had 6 weeks with no rainfall. And it was really starting to cause quite a concern. So I started a research project at Lancaster University to start to try to unpick what the future holds for us if this was to become more normal. So to start with, London's an intensive urban heat island. To do this, we have to understand what that is. So what we tend to do when we look at urban heat islands and we're looking at urban microclimates, we start to look at what the materials are. So, for instance, concrete. And then we look at things like soil capping. So, how much of the soil surface is capped by hard surfaces or its soil compaction. And then we look at the reflection of glass, also air humidity and temperature to make that assessment. Now, when we think of urban heat islands, that's always assessed against the average rural temperatures. Now, what's interesting in Kew's case, you can see Kew is highlighted in that red shape. Uh, Kew's interesting because we've got a very large, diverse collection of trees. So we have a high species diversity. We also have lots of canopy cover. Now, you can see that Kew, there is a lighter, paler colour. Now, that's because of multiple reasons. One, because we're getting the cooling from all our shade, but also the species composition. Now, you can see the blue wiggly line that's going through the centre there. That's the River Thames, and that's cooling through water vapor. And then we can see Richmond Park there, which is elevated above. It's quite high elevation above the rest of Richmond. That's also cooler, but again, that's down to species composition and canopy density. Now, what we find is there's a 2 degrees difference from Kew Road to the southwestern corner of Kew Gardens because of the canopy density and the species diversity. We also know there's nearly a 1.8 to 2 degrees difference from the northern end of our site to the southwest corner. Again, that's down to species composition, but mainly because we've got lots of open grass areas. For us in Kew, when we lose our grass, or when the grass dies, the grass takes on that same properties as concrete. So because we have high visitor numbers, we've got lots of soil compaction, we have shallow soils, so that absorbs heat all day, then radiates at night, which really spikes our nighttime temperatures up. And that's why you often see Kew as the hottest place in the UK. So a lot of my studies is starting to use lots of big data and quite complex data sets. So we have to understand what is our future. So currently, if we look at our baseline data, that we're currently 10 degrees on average at Kew. So over a 12-month period, our average temperature is 10 degrees. Now we can see from the mean annual temperature plot that we're going to shift to 12 over 12 degrees by the mid-century point. By the end of the century, so the 2090s, we're going to be at 14.6. That's a 4 degrees increase in heat. Now, that's really significant, but we know in science it's not just heat that damages and causes issues with trees, it's also to do with water availability. So we then look at our annual precipitation. Now, really interestingly, because of where London sits in central southeast, we actually see our precipitation stays stable, which is a concern because what we would need to see is an increase in heat and an increase in water because the heat increases water demand in a plant. So we have to understand the true impact of that. Now, to understand that, we look at annual potential evapotranspiration, which is how much moisture is used from the soil when with vegetative growth. So when all our plants come out in the growing season, that's how much moisture is being lost from the soil. Now this is in millimeters, so we can see now Q. Because of our soil type, which is bag shot sand over gravel, we have very little water holding potential within our soil. We're already in the negative. So we need 750 mil of moisture content within our soils in order to allow plant growth. And by the end of the century, that goes to 875. Now, to understand the shortfall between precipitation and potential evapotranspiration, we use a calculation called climatic moisture index. And essentially, that is the extent and the intensity of drought. Now, what we can see here, if you can imagine that naught line, so at the top of the grid where it's naught, that is where everything is equal. That is where your precipitation input and your potential evapotranspiration input with your air humidity is all equal. Okay, most of the ecosystems in the UK, they are above that naught line, so they have more moisture and more resources available to them. So they live in a very resource-rich world, and that's what they've adapted to grow to through evolution. So then we have to understand the air. We know that the air drying out. So as we get hotter and drier, we lose the humidity in the air, and that humidity is what drives our water demand. So we have to understand that. And we can see here by the end of the century, we're going to be at 64.1. Now, what we then have to look at is the growing season of plants, and we have to understand our maximum climate water deficit. Now, what we see here is currently we're 316 mil short of water, moisture availability for plants now, but by the end of the century, we're going to be 459 short of moisture for plant growth in the growing season. So that's quite a cause of concern. Now, what we would normally do in that case as a horticultural institute and as a botanic garden is you would create that buffer by irrigation. But we know that by the mid-century, by 2050, drinking water is going to become one of the biggest resource demands that we're going to have, especially in London with the change of precipitation. So we can't carry on irrigating like we currently do. So what I had to do is try to understand this and unpick that question. So to do that, I started to look into climate modeling. So this basically uses lots of species observations and lots of climate layers in order to understand the consequence to our landscapes with these predicted droughts. To start with, what I did is some really boring work in statistics where I looked at all 52 climate variables. So within environmental science, there's 52 variables that are used in research. So what we did is we did an assessment on what is driving observations of plants from with all those climate variables. Now, when you build a model, you can't have too much relationships between those variables because what you would do is create an overfitting or underfitting model. So the predictions are very poor. So you then tend to look at opposites. So, for instance, we could use a temperature variable and a moisture variable, and that will allow you to build a model has a good prediction rate. So, with our knowledge in plant physiology, and also from an experiment we did here at Kew in the Arboretum Nursery, we know that what we see is when we get a hot, warm day, and we have a gentle breeze that dries our air out. Now that air drying, you can measure as vapor pressure deficit. When we see an increase in vapor pressure deficit, what we see is a dryness of the air. When we see that drying of the air, so when we lose our air moisture and humidity, that drives the water demand in plants. Now, different plants have different strategies to deal with that stress. Some may drop their leaves when you see a false autumn. Some may close their stomatas. Some have the toolkit to deal with that stress. So that's what we start to unpick. Now, to unpick that, we found that using the climatic moisture index, which is the difference between annual precipitation and potential evapotranspiration, and then it also includes the air humidity mixed with mean annual temperature is the best predictor when we start looking in plants and the predictability of plants' plasticity to deal with drought. So this is really what's happening at Kew. So if we look at the data point from 1981 to 2010, we're a moist, temperate ecosystem. That is generally what the UK is because we're an island and it's oceanic. And that relies on the jet stream to push these weather fronts through and creating rain. If we all think back to the 90s, I used to watch the cricket, so the Ashes or Wimbledon tennis. How often did rain stop play? How often were the grounds team running on with waterproof covers to cover that ground and stop the pitches from getting wet? We don't see that as often now. Okay, it's been a long time since Wimbledon's been stopped because of rain, and this just shows how these frequent droughts are becoming, and we're shifting an ecosystem. So what we see here in London is an acceleration point from 2010 to 2020. Now, this acceleration point is what I've seen in my time managing trees at Kew. I've been at Kew since 2012, and I've noticed that we're having more frequent droughts, a lot more spring droughts like we're currently in. We're already in drought stressed here in London. So we're seeing this becoming more common, and that's why we see this acceleration point. And then as we go through the decades from 2020, so we go to our mid-century point, which is 2050, we're moving into a subhumid continental climate. And then by the end of the century, we're going to be what we would call forest steppe climate. Now, for trees, that is the last place where trees can naturally grow. So you're looking in a very free draining soil, very hot. So it goes to 40 degrees in the summer throughout the growing season. The average precipitation is about 500 mil. That precipitation tends to fall in the autumn, and we have those warm autumns. And that's what we're seeing become more common in the southeast of the UK. And this trend carries on all the way out to 2090. So we needed to understand how we could use all this information to make predictions. So what I started to do was look at the wild observations of plants, which we use in science. So that's where plants have been observed in the wild, and there's a latitude and longitude point. And what we do is for every latitude and longitude point we have of a tree species, we then connect the environmental layers. And then in the model, what we do is we look at what the predictions are for a particular site. So let's keep it easy, and let's say for London. So we look at what London's predicted climate envelope is today. Well, we know what the climate envelope is today, but then we look at the 2050 point and the 2090 point, and we build climate envelopes. We then look at how many observations of a species sits within that climate envelope, which then allows us to build predictions, and we can build prediction maps. So a lot of this work all kicked off before we did the London work. We did the Kew's landscape succession plan, and that was using this data and this methodology to understand the landscape at Kew. Now we know by the end of the century that 50% of Kew's tree collection is going to be vulnerable by the end of the century. All for you that visited Kew, you would quite easily understand what the dramatic effect of that is. But what we had to do is understand that spatially. So this plot here is all our trees plotted, and then their climates and their climate predictions or their risk is then attached to them. Now, what we can see here, this is on today. Okay, so these are the trees that we know that are going to be vulnerable today. So we see the red ones, we know they're going to be outside their range. So they're going to really struggle to grow at Kew, and we're already seeing those trees. We have mortality in those trees. And then we see our edge of range. They're the trees we don't really know, but they're looking like they're going to be on the very edge of their tolerance in order to be able to thrive at Kew. And then if we move on and accelerate out to 2090, we can see the difference. It's a vastly different site. And you can see now we're getting a lot more reds and a lot more oranges. So we have to understand that impact. Now, my job as head of tree collection is to manage this impact. And how do we manage this going forward? So having data and information around what trees we should be looking at planting is critically important. So what we did is I did a report, or I did a scientific paper on looking at the potential impacts for English natives. And what we can see here is how we move into different zones. So we can see here from 1981 to 2020 on all these native species, we're right in the center of their distribution. But as we go out to 2050 and 2090, we move outside of their distribution range. So this is a visualization of that model I just talked about. So this is every one of those dots is an observation of that plant growing in the wild. And then we look at how our climate envelopes are related to those species. Now, we use this information to do a big report on London. So what we did, we looked at 1.2 million trees within London, and we used this modeling technique. So what we ended up doing for London is we used the species distribution modeling, but we also used functional traits. Now, functional traits are tools that those trees have in order to measure how those tools work when we think of drought tolerance. So we always use leaf dry matter content, wood density, and leaf turgor loss point. Now, I've published papers on this with Dr. Andrew Hirons and Henrik Quellman, and we know and we've proven through peer-reviewed work that these what we call traits are very good at predicting the plant's plasticity to deal with drought. So what we then did is we then created a composite score, and then from that we then created an outcome statement so people can understand what the statistics are telling us. So from doing that work, this is the effect on London's urban canopy. So we can see here that the main standout points, which are very shocking, is the low suitability and vulnerable species. So we know by the end of the century, potentially just over 72% of London's urban canopy is going to be at risk by the end of the century if we carry on planting the same species palette that we currently do. So to try to unpick what trees we should be looking at, we then looked at the data from we basically scanned the globe using London's future climate envelope, and we found that the city of New York is very closely aligned to the predictions of London in 2090. That's New York today. So what we did is we asked them for their data from their cities department, and they gave us their species list. And that's all this is. We don't know how well these trees are growing there, but we know they are growing there. We don't know how they are performing, but this allows us to use these trees for screening, so we can then focus more research and knowledge around these species to understand that question. And then finally, we did something for Hilliers trees where we looked at 18 of their most sold species across 22 cities in the UK to really start to try to unpick what this looks like for them. So what we did is we did the climate modeling for all 22 cities across a spread as much as we could across the UK, and then we try to understand what the impact is. And what we see is we can then start to map this against those observation data of the species. And this is in Quercus robur. It's one of the easiest ones to explain what the potential impacts are. So what we see here is the shift across the centuries. So if we look at early century, that's today, we can see that Quercus robur is mainly vulnerable in Cambridge. But as we go through to the mid-century point, we can see that it then becomes vulnerable in Oxford, London, and Cambridge. And then by the end of the century, we can then see there's Canterbury and Derby and Norwich and other counties that then become more at risk, and we have that low suitability signal. So when we think of this and we think about why we get in this signal, let's think back to the start of the presentation when we talked about 2022 becoming more normal, and you will see there's a very correlation between what that signal was telling us. So the signal that we're picking up there in the southeast and where those trees have that low suitability, we can also pick it up in this aerial image, and that explains why we're picking up these low suitability scores, because this is what we know through modeling that summer of 2022 is going to become more normal. And that's why we're trying to understand as much as we can on how we can create more resilience in our urban forests to be prepared for those future summers of 22 into the future. And that is the final slide. Thank you for listening.
Wow. Thanks, Kevin. That's has to be one of the scariest webinars we've had. Even even the one where we modeled the heat islands in Cardiff, Newport, and Wrexham wasn't quite as worrying as that. Um, I've got a question to start us off while
Hmm.
people are perhaps recovering from their shock. Yeah, and that is when I was looking at the climate diagram for Quercus robur. It
Hmm.
looked like there were quite a few outliers on the right-hand
Yep.
side of that graph. And
Yep.
I'm wondering if those represent land races that we could perhaps select from and grow from you know, for the future, leaving aside
That's
all of the biosecurity issues.
that's 100% what we're doing. So I didn't have time because I wanted to cover the London work. But if I go back, if I do that in my presentation, so um, what I can show you, if I reshare my screen, is what we do. We do something called Euclidean distance. So by using Euclidean distance, we can actually identify suitable ecosystems. So what we do is we use Euclidean distance like this, and then what we can do is then identify latitude and longitude points where we identify where those trees are growing in that 2100 climate envelope. And then that allows us to build in prediction maps. And what we've already done at Kew is we've collected plants from there already. So we have seed growing from those ecosystems, which we know are better suited. And then what I'm doing as part of a PhD research project is then looking at how better those plants perform under that predicted climate in 2100, and that's what we're currently doing. So we're already looking at where we should be selecting trees from, and I'm currently trying to work with the commercial nurseries for them to think about more genetic diversity and where they select their plants from for the future.
Well, that's amazing. It's great to know that that their actions are in hand and that we might actually be able to start to buy stock for our urban trees from places where the climate is similar to what ours is going to be. I
Yeah.
noticed that Nigel has raised his virtual hand. Nigel, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question to Kevin?
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Great presentation. I've got two questions. One is around the amok slowing and
Yeah.
how does that factor into the climate predictions when we could see freezing, much more freezing conditions during the winter, and then those extreme greater heats during the summer, more like sort of the west coast of America and the
Yeah.
situations they're seeing.
Yeah.
And the second question being, how much can we do to mitigate this urban impact heat island effect by actively de-sealing the urban environment and regreening it?
Yeah. So I could answer both of those questions. So yeah, so if you notice when I talk about ecosystems, I talk about the step. Now, the reason why I talk about the steppe is because those models take into that effect of this cold weather. So these environments where we're going to, both Romanian steppe and the Georgian steppe, that goes down to -20 in the winter. And that's because that's how we're building it in. What bugs me the most is when we get TV garden celebrities saying plant Mediterranean plants, because that's not true. If you plant Mediterranean plants, you're going to lose them all in the winter because they don't have cold tolerance. So that's why I look at the steppe because they have that cold tolerance. Now that's built in through plant physiology between how they create a safe hydraulic system. Because believe it or not, the same thing that kills plants when they're cold is the same things that kills plants when they're dry, and that is cavitation of the xylem vessel. And what we see with trees that come from these really extreme environments is they invest very heavily into hydraulic structure, which makes them safe. They grow slower, but that grower slowing is because they invest very heavily into hydraulic structure, which then make them a safer system. And that's what we look at. And yeah, so I do lots of work in London talking about the need for green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is probably I've even spoken in the House of Lords on this and also in Parliament into the Environmental Committee about how we need to get more green in the grey. If we can get more green infrastructure into our built environment, and if we get the species selection right, we can then start to deal with some of these big problems we're seeing in the urban environment through urban heat. What I was at a Chatham House discussion 3 weeks ago, and what it frustrates me, which is not communicated into the media, is we know that there's 2,000 extra deaths a year caused by heat waves alone. There is a mental health. You should see an increase in people suffering with mental health because they're not getting the cooling at night, they're not sleeping, they become more stressed. In 2022, in that heat wave, there was 3,000 extra deaths, which is on track to be the same as COVID, but yet it's not communicated. So one of the ways in order to cool our cities, is to use better green infrastructure, but that needs us to change how we talk about trees. So what I try to do So what I try to do is to talk about how we can use green infrastructure to cool the cities by using those different functional traits. So it's so important that we start to get more green into our environments, but that takes a cultural change. And that's the biggest thing we're seeing is people have to accept change in our urban environments because especially in London, London's not built to hold lots of green infrastructure because there's always a conflict between infrastructure, our ease of life, so how we move around the city, to how much where we park our cars, there's always conflict. And I think until we start talking about trees and the function of trees rather than they just look pretty, we're going to really struggle to get any more green in the grey. So I try to communicate to lots of community groups or landscape architects think about the function of the plant. So if you want a plant to cool the air and you want like pollinators and you want shade, they are part of your selection criteria rather than looking at what that tree visually looks like. And that's what I try to get across. We need to start talking about these functions and not just what they look like.
Thanks, Kevin. AMOC, Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. It's what some people call the Gulf Stream that keeps the UK warmer than it should be. There's a question from Keegan. Keegan, I wonder if you turn on your microphone to ask your question directly to Kevin. And
Hi.
we've got about 6 minutes in which to answer that before the first part of this webinar will finish.
Hi. Yeah, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so I work for Denbighshire County Council in North Wales. I run a tree nursery linked to biodiversity enhancement projects. And we collect local provenance seed from the county and then we grow them on. They typically end up in conservation projects. But we are looking to now start supplying the rest of the county, which means urban trees. And our funding is linked with collecting local provenance seed. I obviously started thinking about assisted migration and climate change in the future, and I was just wondering about if we're trying to collect local provenance and keep it native, which I do or don't know the validity of that. Where would we collect? Should we start collecting from the southeast, for example, or if we wanted to get some genetics into the north to assist with the future climate, where would you suggest we get our seed from?
So it's an interesting one because I'm talking about London and the southeast. It's really dramatic. If we look on the west coast, so where you guys are in Wales, what you're going to see an increase in temperature, but you also get an increase in precipitation. So what you actually will find is a lot of our natives, if we weren't involved with assisted migration, our native species composition will actually shift that way. And this is what's interesting. It's not a one rule fits all. And it's going to be very different to the urban environment to what it is out in the countryside. And we have to think about that. So for your seed problem, yes, you could look at getting seed from the southeast. It will have that bit more adaptivity to drier conditions. But I do believe that, especially when I've done bits looking at Western Burt Arboretum, you will be you'd be surprised how much more rainfall you're going to get. So you will, and you've got a different soil composition. So there is actually quite a big buffer there. So for your natives, for general planting, they're going to be fine. I think you'd have to think a bit more carefully about using that model into your urban environment. So potentially you could look at natives from the southeast, but without doing a lot of work and looking at the data, I don't know how much plasticity they would potentially have. Is the honest truth.
Thanks again,
Thank
Kevin.
you very
And
much.
very briefly, we've got a question from Mark in the chat. Mark, could you unmute yourself? And bearing in mind, we've only got 4 minutes to answer this one.
Yeah, hi. Okay, very quickly. I've been doing some work with forest research, some woodland that I'm involved with, and they were talking about the plasticity of regeneration from seed, just from parent plants, and the importance of natural regeneration to cope with climate change. And given their comments around that, it was really whether bringing seed in from the steppe, growing in the UK conditions now, whether they will lose perhaps some of that.
No, because you'll think of epigenetics. So with an epigenetics, so if we use an oak tree, for example, with your genetics, so it has that genetic plasticity from the steppe because it's where it's grown and it's evolved to grow in.
Yeah.
If we bring it into the UK, it would take 3 generations minimum for it to adjust its genetic trait and to lose that information, how to deal with drought. So what you would see, so for oaks, let's say on average, oaks live for 500 years. That's 1,500 years. Now, what we're going to see is the acceleration of climate in under 70. Now, that works the other way. So if we didn't have the human influence on climate change, so pre-industrial levels, and we look at the trends from pre-industrial levels, if we didn't have this acceleration point, there is potential that the trees would adjust in time, but it would take 1,500 years. The problem we're seeing is we're going to see that change in under 100, and that's within one life cycle of a plant. So, of a tree. So it's because it's this acceleration change within one generation, they haven't got the time to adjust genetically to pass that information on to the young. So then the third generation for them to have that trait. So, and that's what we look at. That's all part of epigenetics.
Thank you.
Right. I see we've got another question from Nigel. Nigel, will you unmute yourself? We have about a minute to answer this one.
Sorry, do you find the Woodland Trust narrative of tree equity helpful for making the case for urban green infrastructure increase?
Yeah, the Woodland Trust. Me and the Woodland Trust don't quite rub along well. Yeah. So I've spoken to them in this, and they're starting to change their stance on the native seed thing in urban environments, which is good. A lot of what the Woodland Trust are suggesting is not backed up by any scientific proof. And that's the problem I have. They seem to play on people's emotions rather than the research.
Sorry, I was specifically talking about tree equity, the narrative of the social inequality of green infrastructure.
Yeah. So, yeah, there is inequality. How we deal with that, I don't know, especially in London boroughs. There is a wider piece around how we manage that. But that goes down to policy and it goes down to strategy, really, from local authorities. And the problem we have in London is some of the richer boroughs are going to be able to buy more stock available that's more adapted to future climates than the poorer boroughs. And that's how do you manage that? Like in London, we don't have an overall overarching tree policy for planting. It's all devolved to those to the local borough areas. So unless it's a borough priority, it's really difficult to manage.
Thanks very much, Kevin. We're about to get cut off, so please do close down Zoom and rejoin us using the original link.